Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Henry Fortunato, Director of Public Affairs. And, you know, tonight's program I kind of think was inspired by Mark Twain. Mark Twain famously said, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so tonight we're going to give you an example of how we use statistics at the library. It's a 45-minute program, and you won't fall asleep, or you might. Actually, no statistics at all, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that might be framed as a series of questions. These questions are as follows. Is America facing an epidemic of lying, particularly on the part of the rich, the famous, and the prominent, who seemingly have so much to lose? Why are they doing this? And how is their behavior affecting the rest of us? Well, to talk about that more, tonight's guest is James B. Stewart, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, the Bloomberg Professor of Business Journalism at Columbia University, and the author of 9 books. Actually, on his website, no, not his website, but on many websites it says 11 books. In the pursuit of truth, let us be clear, it's only 9 books. Only 9 books. But most recently, Tangled Webs, How False Statements Are Undermining America, from Martha Stewart to Bernie Madoff. So, you know, in his journalism career, James Stewart has been no stranger to individuals who have had, let us say, a tenuous relationship with the truth. His national bestseller, Den of Thieves, revealed the shenanigans of Wall Street in the 1980s. His Pulitzer was for a series of Wall Street Journal articles on the 1987 stock market crash and the insider trading scandals. And on the political front, there was yet another bestseller, Bloodsport, that detailed the always truthful Clinton White House. When he's not writing bestsellers or teaching at Columbia, he writes the Common Sense column for the Business Day section of the New York Times and contributes regularly to the New Yorker. Now, you know, I have to tell you, back in the early 19th century, when I was an undergraduate at Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service, I had the good luck to have several professors who had been retired ambassadors. One of them in particular had an interest in me. He was kind of my mentor, and he gave me this piece of advice. It was 3 parts. Part 1 was never lie. Part 2 was never feel the need to tell the precise truth. And part 3 was never fail to take advantage of the opportunity to use the bathroom. And by the way, if you want, it's down the hall and to your right. Anyway, conducting tonight's public conversation is our own paragon of truth, though occasionally he does have some selective memory issues. My dear friend and esteemed colleague, everyone's favorite library director, Crosby Kemper III. And following his chat with James Stewart, we'll open up the conversation to many of you. And after that, James will be signing books right over there. And then we'll see you again next week. Ladies and gentlemen, Crosby Kemper and James Stewart.
I found Den of Thieves, our library copy of Den of Thieves, in the fiction section a few moments ago. Well, we'll be having a conversation with the catalogers. It's a great book, but I actually want to kick this off because not only is James Stewart writing a column for the New York Times, but he also continues to be a feature writer, and in fact has the lead feature article on the front page of the New York Times today. And it's about that deeply significant investigative journalism subject, broccoli. How broccoli landed on the Supreme Court menu. There's a front page article in this huge, in the B section, huge continuation, all 5 columns, full page. And it is a fascinating history of how Antonin Scalia came to the question of of whether or not, if Obamacare passes, if they approve the Obamacare law, we won't soon be finding ourselves being forced to eat broccoli. Personally, I love broccoli. So, you know, if they outlaw broccoli, they'll have to come and pry it from my cold, dead hands. But I wanted to challenge Mr. Stewart on one of the words in the article. He takes the history back to David Rivkin, lawyer. 1993, when the Clinton care thing started, the whole idea of broccoli. But you refer to Mr. Rivkin's unorthodox theory. He uses the word unorthodox, and it just speaking as a libertarian. It seems to me that maybe it's the original orthodox theory that we ought to restrict the Commerce Clause. And just as I'm going to spring this on you right now, I'm going to read from Federalist 45. It's my midnight reading, you know. James Madison writing Federalist 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. With the last, the power of taxation will be for the most part connected. The power is reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order and prosperity of the state. Shouldn't that be the orthodox view, James Madison's view?
Well, are you questioning my use of the word unorthodox?
Yes.
Or the history of the
No, actually,
Commerce Clause? Well, I guess I would defend the word in saying that by today's standards it's unorthodox. That the Federalist paper that you just quoted precedes a famous Supreme Court by John Marshall that said the Commerce Clause power can be used by Congress, yes, to its utmost extent, number one. And number two, the New Deal and various Supreme Court cases there, which also embraced a very, very expansive view of the Commerce Clause. Now, I'm not saying either this article or now what is, correct from a constitutional point of view, but the orthodox view is, and has been, until very recently certainly, that Congress could pretty much do anything that touches on interstate commerce if it wanted to.
So they could force us to eat broccoli.
They couldn't force it to eat it, but they could force it to buy it. And actually, I noticed, it could sit there uneaten and rotting and used for compost, but you would have to buy it. And I think, actually, someone wrote into the Times today, I happened to see the letter online, in which they pointed out that, and I guess in various school programs or in some areas right now, people are being required to buy broccoli. Our children being required to buy it at lunch or something like that.
And in your own city of New York, I happened to also not only get this today, the New York Times today, but I got to this New Yorker today. I don't know if you've seen the New Yorker's cover, but it refers to Mayor Bloomberg. These two people are surreptitiously hiding in an alley in New York with their Big Gulp, their supersized soda, to protect themselves, which they're obviously not successfully doing, from Mayor Bloomberg's Gestapo, which wants to stop us from drinking big gulps and supersized soda.
I will say, it still always seems funny to me when people say my hometown is New York, because I actually am a Midwesterner, and I'm from Quincy, Illinois, and we used to come to Kansas City periodically. In fact, I got on the train here in the train station with my family to take the train to Los Angeles to go to Disneyland in 1960. So that was a very exciting moment in my Kansas City history.
Well, that must explain why you're such a great journalist. Your Midwestern roots. But let's go from broccoli to the subjects of your book, the Tangled Webs. And there's a kind of extension in this book of what you've written about before, Den of Thieves, which is about the prosecutions, among other things, and prevarications of a number of Wall Street figures, Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, et cetera, from those early days of cowboy capitalism on Wall Street. And then Bloodsport, which, as Henry mentioned, is about the Clintons and substantially about their glancing relationship with the truth. And so Tangled Webs is a series of stories about people who have a problem with the truth, and you're dealing with a number of perjury prosecutions. And as you say, perjury is sort of the forgotten crime in America.
Well, I think almost every prosecutor agrees that it's one of the most under-prosecuted crimes because, as they've said to me, people lie to them under oath really every day. They come to work, and one prosecutor said the only question is, how good are they going to be at the lying? Now, one reason perjury doesn't get prosecuted as much as it might is there's a policy in the Justice Department that if they are charging a major crime in which someone lied as part of the investigation, they typically don't also charge the perjury. So they'll sometimes just sweep that in with the main crime. And that may be why, curiously, several of the cases I ended up writing about, they were only charged with perjury.
With perjury,
they were being
yeah.
investigated for something else. They lied in the course of the investigation. Ironically, they never were charged with the actual crime.
And there is a history of that happening too. Bill Clinton is a good example of someone they were going after for lots of different things in Whitewater and other things, but ultimately what he got charged with, the one criminal prosecution, was perjury.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. I mean,
and why he lost his license to practice law. Well, there is a sort of, one of the big stories you have in here, one of the most fascinating stories, is about Scooter Libby, who was the aide to Vice President Cheney, who was indicted for perjury in the Valerie Plame affair. I happened to go to school with Scooter Libby, at Andover with Scooter Libby. He wasn't known as Scooter at that point. I don't know when he got the name. But there's a sort of a conservative view of this, that he was persecuted, that they were trying. It was another way of attacking the Bush administration for its Iraq policy, and that he was never indicted. No one was ever indicted, as you indicate, for the original charge, the original crime, which was outing a CIA agent, Valerie Plame, which is against the law, and he was only indicted for lying about who he had talked to about outing her. I mean, doesn't it? And that's true in some of the other cases that you talk about here. They're indicted for perjury, but not for the actual original crime. Is there a problem with that?
well, let me say, first of all, the political criticism of the Libby prosecution, in my view, is complete nonsense, as, by the way, was liberal criticism of the investigation of Bill Clinton. These were not politically motivated prosecutions, although many very ideological people just refuse to believe that. I think that in the political arena especially, where in a democracy we depend on truthful statements from our elected officials in order to make informed decisions at the voting place, underscores how important telling the truth under oath or to law enforcement authorities has to be. I mean, I don't think a democracy can really function without accurate information. So when you have a very high-level official, whether it's the president or in Scooter Libby's case, he was the chief of staff to Vice President Cheney and an assistant, a top foreign policy advisor to President Bush, it's vitally important that we be able to trust what people like that are telling us and telling the people around them.
And the whole issue of this case, in fact, revolved around the accuracy of initially a report that Joseph Wilson, the husband of Valerie Plame, had made for the CIA about whether or not the Iraqis were looking for nuclear material in Niger, I think it was in Africa, and then whether or not what he said about it on Meet the Press, was it, or some TV program?
Well, what happened, you know, the CIA agent Valerie Plame was outed by unnamed administrative officials in a Bob Novak column.
As a way of attacking her husband.
As a way of undermining her husband, who had said there was no yellow cake from Niger being purchased by Iraq. And
which President Bush had referred to in his State of the Union address, which was a justification.
Right. And what really galled the Bush administration was the charge that they knowingly put false information into the State of the Union address. And oddly enough, from a truth context, they were right about that. Joe Wilson, the ambassador, had really just leaped to the conclusion that since he wrote that report, they must have read it, they must have accepted it, they must have known about that and then put it in. And it turned out that none of that was actually true. But putting that aside, they decided, well, the way to counteract this negative publicity, which created a furor at the time, was let's expose his wife as a CIA agent. Now, I have to say, I've never understood that from a PR perspective. It sounds like the act of desperate people to me, because as indeed happened, a lot of journalists heard this and were kind of scratching their head and thought, well, who cares who his wife is?
Right.
And, but they thought this was a sizzling story. So various administration people went out and tried to push this story on the press. Finally, Bob Novak took the bait, and he wrote it in his column. The problem is they didn't seem to be aware of the fact that it is a crime to expose the identity of a covert CIA agent, by the way, for rather obvious reasons. This had happened earlier, and the person whose identity was exposed was murdered in Athens.
Philip Agee, who,
yes.
And in fact, if I remember correctly, the law that's currently on the books that originally they were investigating was a result of that. And of course, it was mostly conservatives who were outraged by the fact that Philip Agee who had himself been a CIA agent, had exposed all these people, and somebody in Greece had died.
But in any event, it seems to me that common sense would tell you don't go around blabbing the names of covert CIA agents.
But part of the argument was she wasn't really an agent. She was an analyst in Washington who didn't have any covert role.
Well, I would want to err on the side of caution about that. Anyway, I don't see why they did it, but they did it. And then there was a furor about this, and immediately then, of course, people realized it's a political blunder, this is making the whole matters worse, and nobody wanted to admit it. And because it was a crime, they launched an investigation, and various administration members got asked, were you the source for Bob Novak? Did you go to any other journalists? Were you leaking the name? And they came around to Scooter Libby, and they said, did you leak this identity? And he said, oh, no, I certainly didn't do that. And in the very first interview, I thought it was very striking that the FBI agent conducting it pulled out notes that had been produced from a conversation in which Vice President Cheney told him that she was a CIA agent. Oh, he claimed he didn't even know she was a CIA agent. And in Scooter Libby's handwriting, it had her name, CIA agent, it had all the information right there. So from day one, the story did not hold up.
Right.
And
though ironically, isn't it true that Scooter Libby wasn't the first person to talk to Bob Novak?
Well, the irony was he didn't talk to him at all.
Right.
He was not a source for the column. Karl Rove, that's a whole interesting story in itself, and Richard Armitage in the State Department were the two sources for the Novak column. And so, but they were asking, did anyone else tell him? So he had an obligation to answer truthfully. So then he committed, I'm not here to tell you how to lie, believe me, but if you are going to lie, I think everybody agrees, you try to stick as close to the actual facts as possible and then just fudge the ones that are really important. But Scooter Libby decided to just freelance this whole fantasized story that he said, first of all, oh, I see the note in my handwriting that Vice President Cheney told me your identity, but I completely forgot that. And I didn't really know her name. And in fact, I couldn't have leaked it because I only found out her name when Tim Russert, the bureau chief of NBC and host of Meet the Press, told me in a telephone conversation. Okay, so the FBI agent, what would you do if you're the FBI agent? He went and he called Tim Russert and said, did you tell Scooter Libby the name of Valerie Plame? And he said, no, I talked to him, but the subject never came up, and I didn't even know who she was. I didn't know she was a CIA agent. Now here's a key point I want to make here, because the Scooter Libby defenders have run around saying, oh, it was a political prosecution, and by the way, he was picked on because he was, an important person. They wanted to embarrass the administration. In every one of these cases, the rich, the famous, the powerful get special treatment that if you and I were being investigated, we wouldn't get. The FBI agent, and here's an example, went back to Scooter Libby and his lawyer and said, oh, by the way, we just interviewed Tim Russert, and Tim Russert contradicts your story. He said he did not tell you her name, and he didn't know the name, and you didn't even discuss it. Would you like to correct your testimony? So here's the golden opportunity for Scooter Libby to say, oh, I must have been confused, we had so many conversations about it, whatever. No, he's stuck by the story, and he said, oh, I always thought Tim Russert was a stand-up guy, but obviously he's not telling the truth. And he stuck by the story, and his main story was, I could not have leaked her identity because I didn't know she was a CIA agent. By the time this investigation was over and at his trial, no fewer than 9 White House staff people testified to conversations they had with Scooter Libby about the identity of Valerie Plame before the Bob Novak column came out. So this is an example. If he just said, I don't really remember, or maybe it came up somewhere, but I can assure you I was not the source for the Bob Novak column, end of investigation.
Well, and as you say, I think you use this phrase in the book, he had kind of created a parallel universe, a narrative in his head, and he couldn't get out of that narrative. And if as you say, he had taken what the FBI agent said to him and just said, oh, a mistake, you're right, Tim Russert's right, I believe no one's ever actually been indicted under this or is convicted under this statute.
No, it's a very tough statute to prosecute anyone under, because when you leak the information, you must know that the person is a covert agent, and there's some other elements of it that make it's very hard to prove that state of mind. So no one was ever charged under this. Karl Rove and Richard Armitage came close, but it was a close case.
They would have gotten Rove in particular on perjury, not on the.
Yes.
And Armitage is the one who they could have gotten because he was the main source. He's the main source, and you tell a great story about it's Bob Woodward who reminds him that because he had talked to Woodward for Woodward's other book, for the Woodward book.
He'd pushed the story on Woodward, and Woodward didn't use it.
And Woodward didn't use it, but then Woodward, when they're about to indict her, they had indicted Libby, reminds Armitage that he actually was the guy who outed Plame.
Well, Armitage testified under oath that he only leaked this information to Bob Novak. And then this information became public, and Bob Woodward called him up and said, Dick, aren't you forgetting something? Didn't you talk to me? And I have to say, this was a very fascinating thing, because of course, Bob Woodward is a legend to me. I mean, he's, the greatest investigative reporter of our time. So I called him interview about this. I have to say, I was wondering, why was he calling him up? I mean, it was a off-the-record interview. I really wonder, I think in a way, Bob Woodward wanted everyone to know that he was really the first journalist to have ever heard that, and I can't say that for sure, but I think he has a big ego. And so he says to Armitage, well, didn't you forget this? And then Armitage, I think very smartly at that point, called up the prosecutor and said, okay, I'm really embarrassed to have to tell you this, but I did tell someone else. It was Bob Woodward, and then he came clean with the whole story. So the issue was, when he first testified and said, I didn't ever tell anyone else, would he have forgotten an interview with Bob Woodward? Now, personally, I think if you've had an interview with Bob Woodward, you'd probably remember it, but again, memory issues are tricky. Very few people, Martha Stewart got charged for saying she forgot, but that's very unusual. The Rove case is even worse, but again, in contrast to Libby, Rove said, okay, I confirmed it to Bob Novak, but that's the only person I spoke to. Then they find these emails where he's telling Matt Cooper at Time magazine. So his lawyer, very much to his credit, Robert Luskin, goes straight to the prosecutor and says, we want to come back in, we're going to correct our testimony. And unlike Libby, who just dug in, Rove came back before the grand jury and he said, now that I've seen this email, it refreshes my memory that I was leaking. And, did people really believe that? Well, no, but it's a tough case. Tough case to make.
You say it wasn't a political prosecution, and I think you're right. I think they're absolutely trying to do the right thing, but there's also an element of this. You quote an FBI.
Well, let me just say, if it was a political prosecution, they would have charged Karl Rove.
Right.
You could easily have made that case. Would you have wanted a trial? I don't know, but you would not have been criticized for bringing that indictment.
Fitzgerald did send a letter to the president, take it to his counsel to make it clear to the president that Rove had lied.
Not only lied, but to me, one of the most interesting things about this, he not only lied in the grand jury, he lied to Bush.
Right.
Because when questioned in the grand jury about what he told the president, Rove said, oh, I was forthright with him. I told him that Novak called, and I told him what I said. Then they interviewed President Bush, and President Bush said he claimed that Valerie Plame had never come up in the conversation. So he hadn't even been candid with the commander-in-chief, which is a pretty serious issue. And again, I thought it was fascinating. Fitzgerald really did an unusual thing. He wrote a letter to the president. He used a national security exception to grand jury secrecy. He revealed to President Bush what Rove had said, and basically said, you ought to fire this guy.
Right.
Bush did not.
I do want to challenge just a little bit, get your response to, I guess would be the best way to put it. You quote, and I think you're quoting the FBI agent Jack Eckenrode, who's something of a hero in the book about, in the process, the FBI agents wanted to indict Rove and indict Armitage. Mm-hmm. And you quote him saying, we had a duty to the country, still he felt justice was done, but we had a duty to the country to discover if there was a conspiracy among senior administration officials to discredit Joe Wilson or anyone else who criticized the president's policy. This is how it looked to me. I read that sentence and I was startled by it because it seems to me, a group of people in the White House getting together to discredit Joe Wilson is a conspiracy I'd be happy to join. And there doesn't seem anything indictable about that. It seems to me at some point in the prosecution, the FBI and some of the prosecutors came to believe they had a mission and that maybe they escaped the bounds of prosecutorial hygiene, if you will. You don't think that? Obviously you don't think that.
No, I mean, I think they took their job seriously. I know one of the points that Eckenrode made is that leak investigations were often conducted mostly for show, that nobody ever really wanted to get to the bottom of these things. It involved First Amendment issues, but if you're going to take the law seriously, if certain kinds of leaks are in fact a crime, and there are a few, it comes up in the Bonds case where grand jury transcripts were leaked. And we've now seen that, the havoc created by, this WikiLeaks guy, printing, 500,000 pages of confidential State Department documents. If you're going to take leaking seriously, then you have to pursue those cases and get to the bottom. And I think when he said a conspiracy to discredit, he meant a criminal conspiracy. He didn't mean just taking to the public airwaves to discredit him.
And there's a journalistic ethic question here that you talk about a little bit. You deal with a little bit in the book, but maybe let me ask you directly, because you brought up Assange and the WikiLeaks, which the Times published, your newspaper published, and also the latest revelations about Stuxnet and the U.S. The president picking assassination targets, and the U.S. and the Israelis getting together to attack Iran's computer network and that sort of thing. Is there an ethical problem for the newspaper, for you as a journalist, not you personally, but for one as a journalist, in doing these things that might harm the nation, might harm individuals, publishing these things?
Well, I think there are two prongs to this question. One, which comes up in the book, both in the Libby case and in the Barry Bonds perjury case, because journalists either did go to jail in Judy Miller's case or almost went to jail in the Bonds case. What ethical restraints are there in asking a source to break the law and give you information? And I think that is a serious problem, that as a journalist, I'm not going to ask someone to go steal something and to give it to me. I wouldn't ask them to give me confidential grand jury transcripts. And the issue in WikiLeaks is if a journalist induces someone to break the law by giving them confidential information, do they then become a co-conspirator and liable for the crime? No journalist has been prosecuted under that theory, but the San Francisco reporters in the Barry Bonds case came close, and they're investigating the Julian Assange on that theory. Now, then more generally, do you have an ethical? So my answer to that is yes. You have an ethical obligation not to ask someone to break the law, and that as journalists, we have an obligation to obey the law ourselves. There is no higher calling than the law, the criminal laws that we're expected to obey along with everyone else. If you get information that's sensitive and could endanger people, it may endanger the public good if you print it. That's a different question. I don't think that's a crime or a potential crime. I think it's something you have to weigh very carefully, and I know in many instances editors at papers have not published information because they thought it would be damaging. On the other hand, I've had so many people tell me, oh, it's going to be terrible if you print this, or it's going to harm people, or I've even had people say, I'm going to commit suicide if you print that.
Gee.
And I'm happy to say no one ever
No one has
no
yet.
one has.
Well, let's look at it from the other side too. Both at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, you're very eloquent about the consequences of lying and what this leads to. And it seems to me, you talk a little bit about this in the book, and I'd love to hear more. One of the things that happened that I think Rove and Cheney to this day don't understand, I don't know about Libby, but it strikes me some other people in the administration, some of whom you talk about, Scott McClellan, for instance, understand this, that what they did, not initially in leaking, but lying about it, destroyed the legitimacy of the Bush administration.
Absolutely. I mean, and why wouldn't it? I mean, you have a very, very high-level official convicted by a jury of multiple counts of not just giving out false information like on a television show or something, but going before the grand jury, holding up his hand, swearing, taking the oath to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, and then repeatedly lying. Now, how could you believe anything that comes out of an administration that tolerates something like that? And then you see some very slippery testimony from people like Rove and Armitage as well. Of course, it completely undermines public confidence, and why wouldn't it? I mean, one of the main reasons I did this book was to explore the question of, well, why is it a crime that we have perjury to begin with, and where did it come from? So I spent a little time tracing the history of it. I mean, I'm really convinced, and I feel very passionately about it, that civilization as we know it rests on this obligation to tell the truth when sworn to do so. I mean, it shows up in the Ten Commandments. It was a crime in the Roman Code, going all the way back to the Roman Empire. It was prosecuted in the ecclesiastical courts in the Middle Ages. It was then absorbed into the civil law of England. We got that tradition in our law. You can't have a judicial and legal system without people giving truthful evidence. But more broadly, in these stories, I think you show, you can't have a functioning democracy without it. You can't have functioning capital markets and investments without it. And if we're not going to honor that, then as a civilization, I think we're doomed.
Well, and you wonder about Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney is on record as saying that he learned from the certain lessons from the Nixon administration. It seems to me he learned the basically wrong lesson from the Nixon administration, that the administration's credibility and legitimacy totally failed, went out the window because Richard Nixon lied. As Barry Goldwater said about him, there's one sentence to say about Richard Nixon: he is a liar.
Yeah, well, you look at the Libby case, and the broad question, well, why would Libby have told this lie? I mean, it was a bad lie from the very beginning, as I mentioned, and it got only worse as time went on. So why was he doing it to begin with? He's a lawyer. He knows his obligations. He knows the political dynamic. I think the simple answer is, and this is true in many of these stories, loyalty. He was protecting Dick Cheney. It's pretty obvious what happened. Dick Cheney got all upset about this. He told Libby, get the word out there. We're going to undermine this guy. Get the word out about the wife. Libby dutifully did it, and then he was going to lie about it to protect Cheney. So why is he protecting Cheney? Loyalty. Cheney is the vice president. He's powerful. He's above him in the hierarchy. He is serving him. And in so many of these stories, loyalty is the excuse. Whether it's Barry Bond's trainer who's lying about it, whether it's Martha Stewart's stockbroker who's lying about it, they say, oh, well, loyalty is a higher good. But if you think about it, loyalty can never be a higher good than the obligation to tell the truth.
But, and so I think you mentioned Martha Stewart, so now maybe for a moment of comic relief in this enterprise. Your story about Martha Stewart, I mean, loyalty, Bukanovic, her stockbroker, and Martha Stewart herself, who are the principals in this, and you might just tell quickly the story about Imclone and the Waxels and whatnot. But is it really loyalty, or did she not know enough to know that she shouldn't have taken Bukanovic's advice, and then they were just a den of thieves, to quote your title? Is it really loyalty? The failure of loyalty is a really important part of your story about Martha Stewart because of Bukanovic's assistant, right, who takes a lot of the heat and is the guy who finally comes clean.
Well, in the Martha Stewart story, as you may remember, she was on her way to vacation in Mexico the day after Christmas. She was a stockholder in her friend's company, Imclone, which had a big cancer drug waiting approval from the FDA. And
These guys were very
they were
slippery
really
characters.
bad.
I mean,
Oh,
boy, you
God.
read about them and you can't believe anybody would ever have invested in any of their companies.
I mean, again, it says something that these are the people Martha Stewart wants to hang out with. But nevertheless, Sam Waxel gets the word that the FDA is going to turn down the drug. He knows the stock's going to collapse. He calls his broker at Merrill Lynch, who's also Martha Stewart's broker, and says, "Get me out of here. I want to sell it all." The broker's on vacation. His young, innocent assistant gets the call and says, "Well, I can't do that. You're the CEO. I see here I can't, trade your shares." So he then calls the broker and says, "My God, the whole family's trying to sell. His daughter is calling me. What do I do?" And they're talking about this when suddenly Peter Buchanan says, "Oh my God, get Martha Stewart on the phone." So he leaves a message for her. Martha calls back on the way to Mexico, and basically the assistant says, "Sam Waxel's dumping all of his shares. What do you want to do?" And she says, "Sell." But they cooked up the story that the real reason she sold was because she had a pre-established order to sell if it went below $60, which it did that day. And she, the stockbroker, and at least initially the assistant, all lied, saying that story.
And as you point out, if she'd simply, even if she'd taken the advice, but then had been truthful about it, probably the worst thing that would have happened to her is she would have coughed up the $46,000, I think, that was the profit she would have made. She probably never would have been indicted, maybe not even had a civil case.
Well, she would have had
against
the
her.
civil case. But, again, you think these people must be very smart and good at these things. But, again, her lie was so bad. Initially, when they asked the broker, why did she sell this? He said, it was tax loss selling. It was tax loss selling because it was towards the end of the year. And, a lot of people sell losses they can deduct against their income. Well, there was only one problem with that theory, which was she had a big gain. No one in the history of the world has ever engaged in tax loss selling by selling a stock at a gain. So, 2 days later, without missing a beat, the assistant's on the phone, and he said, "Now, why was it that she sold?" And he says, "Oh, it was a stop loss order at $60. And the assistant's thinking, "But wait a minute, what happened to the tax loss selling?" No, it just this whole story just changed without any explanation. So, and of course, that was a bogus story as well. But going back to this loyalty point, the stockbroker took his assistant out and said, "Look, Martha Stewart is everything to me. She's my biggest client. She's famous. She stood by me. I'm going to be loyal to her." And you see this permeating these stories, and yet when you think about it, how does the loyalty work? It only runs in one direction,
yeah.
from the rich and the powerful to the weak and the less wealthy and the less celebrated. It never goes the other way. So Greg Anderson is the trainer for Barry Bonds, and the evidence strongly suggests he repeatedly injected him with steroids. So he lies about it. Then he refuses to testify. He goes to jail for contempt because he won't testify. And it's all out of loyalty to Barry Bonds. So does Barry Bonds ever show any loyalty to him? Does he ever come out and say, "Look, I don't believe I ever knowingly took steroids, but Greg, I don't want you going to jail for me, so go to the grand jury and testify, just tell the truth, whatever, let's let the chips fall where they will"? No. And that's the problem when you substitute loyalty for the truth, that if the people who can command loyalty end up determining what the truth is. And that means the rich and the powerful, and I suppose in another day, the people with the biggest weapons. That is the law of the jungle. I was very struck, thank you. When Greg Anderson finally got out of jail because the case was over, they didn't need his testimony anymore, and he never broke his silence, the other prisoners at the prison gathered around and gave him a standing ovation as he left the prison. And I was thinking, well, that figures. That's the law of the prison ground.
Right.
The mafia.
And going back to Martha, she was able to create a sense of victimhood about herself, and
that's another one. She was persecuted because she was a successful woman. She got every break. They didn't want to prosecute her. The facts are completely different. And again, the loyalty issue. You see how she treated the people who did tell the truth.
Ann Armstrong.
Yeah, like her assistant, her loyal assistant in many years. Now here's some comic relief. As soon as she did it, she didn't get the plum pudding, which Martha gave everybody for Christmas every year, and then she didn't even get the Christmas card, and then she wouldn't even speak to her, and she was she had to leave the company, and she's very vindictive and ruthless, and indeed, well here's another amusing story about Martha Stewart, that the star witness against her ended up being not so much the broker who changed his testimony, but her assistant, Ann Armstrong, and then her so-called best friend, Mariana Pasternak, who was on the trip with her to Mexico when all this happened. And so they went on this trip, and when they came back, Martha Stewart billed her company for the entire cost of the trip. It was about $70,000. And she wrote on the form, business conference with Steve Schwarzman. I wrote a profile of Steve Schwarzman in the New Yorker. He's a billionaire. So I called him and I said, did you have some kind of meeting with Martha Stewart in Mexico the day after Christmas? And he said, no. He said, we passed each other in the lobby of the hotel and I said hello. So, okay, there's a false statement, a bogus thing. So she got 100% of the cost reimbursed by the company, public company at this point, so this is shareholder money. Then she had her accountant call Mariana Pasternak, who went with her on the trip, and said, you have to pay your fair share. Now, I don't know exactly how much she had to cough over, but Martha Stewart was double dipping on this trip. She'd already been 100% reimbursed, and then she makes her best friend pay. So the prosecutors come around and they go to Mariana Pasternak and they say, well, we'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened while you were in Mexico. Now, according to Mariana Pasternak, she now had this heart-wrenching struggle with herself about would she do her duty as a citizen and tell the truth, or would she be loyal to Martha Stewart? Would she be loyal to Martha Stewart? So she decided she had to do her duty, and she testified that while they were in Mexico, Martha said to her, oh, isn't it nice to have brokers who tell you things? Which really was the line that put the nail in Martha Stewart's coffin. But nevertheless, I've often wondered, if Martha Stewart had not made her pay for the trip to Mexico, would she have ended up feeling she had to do her civic duty?
Right. Then she gets out of jail, and it's Barbara Walters. She says she refers to herself as like Nelson Mandela. Pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make these stories up. That's why I'm glad you've taken Den of Thieves out of the fiction category, because people do ask me, why don't I write fiction? I say, well, why would I write fiction when this is what's really happening?
This is too good. Well, another major story that you write about is the Bernie Madoff story, and it's an unbelievable story the way you tell it. I mean, those of us like me who have been in the financial arena and have had encounters with regulators, I've never thought terribly highly of the regulators, but after reading your book, I think it's amazing that there isn't more fraud. I mean, Bernie Madoff had been doing this for years and years and years, and it was the simplest possible fraud. He had no money and no.
There was nothing there.
You start off talking about hedge funds and in the black box secrets and whatnot, and of course Bernie Madoff was able to convince 4,800 people, I think is the number you used, that he had a black box. I mean, how did he do that?
Well, it's, again, I thought, well, Bernie Madoff must be the best liar of the group. I mean, he kept it going for at least 20 years, if not longer, and he survived 4 SEC investigations. I was amazed by that. I thought, oh, maybe there'd been 1. No, there were 4, and he slithered out of every one of them. So I thought he must be a genius liar. So as many of you know, anybody at least bit familiar with the investment world, everybody from the time markets were created have been trying to figure out how to sell high and buy low, and only sell high and buy low. That's how you make a fortune. And even though it sounds simple, no one has found that formula. And yet the SEC looks at the Madoff trading records, and that was really what he purported to be doing. He's only in the market when it's going up, and he's always out of it when it's going down. It looked like he had the magic key.
Well, and he's at least one of the investigations, he tells them he's only in the market for a very short period of time. And he's doing these fairly amazing returns, and these consistently amazing returns.
Always consistent.
11% a year. So they refer to him in Palm Beach as the Jewish T-bill.
Jewish T-bill, yes. I mean, he could only be in brief periods at certain times in order to make the numbers work, which of course he was doing with benefit of hindsight. But anyway, the SEC didn't know this, so it looks like he's the biggest genius ever.
But they never actually really, as far as I can tell from your book, from the story, in these 4 different investigations, they never actually look at real trade at any trading.
No, because he kept refusing to turn them over, and then they wouldn't ask. But anyway, they did ask him about this, so they brought him in for a sworn deposition. You can read this testimony, and they said, "Okay, so what is your secret? How have you been able to do which no MIT scientist and no computer scientist and no one in the history of mankind has ever been able to do?" And he said, "Well," he said, "it's like if you take a blender and you put oranges and peaches in there, and if you put the blender on one speed, it comes out one way, and if it comes out another, it's another." And then he's blathering on and on. Pretty soon he's talking about TVs in the trading room. And they just kind of said, "Okay, fine, next question." And I was thinking to myself, oranges and apples in the blender, that's the secret to your trading? I mean, it's preposterous. The lies were so bad.
Yeah.
But to me, the important point of the Madoff story, although it's fascinating, is what happens when people, in fact, don't take perjury very seriously. And that's what the regulators did in his case.
Because they knew he was lying to.
They did know. I mean, they were incompetent many steps along the way, but they knew he was lying. And the lower level investigators in particular were saying, "Wait a minute, he told me one thing 2 weeks ago, and now he's telling 180 degrees the opposite.
Yeah.
I'm a witness to the fact. He can't be right on both." And they kept saying, "Oh, well, can't we find something else?" It was kind of the criticism that you said, that people don't like to bring just perjury cases. And so they kept saying, "Well, look for something else. There must be something bigger. Why perjury, what's the big deal anyway?" And if they had only called the Justice Department, because when they had that critical showdown when the investigators were saying, "Wait a minute, he's lying, he's lying, he's lying," he only had purportedly $20 billion under investment. And when he finally came crashing down, it's 65. That meant their failure to hand that over to the Justice Department for a perjury case meant investors lost another $45 billion. I can't imagine a more vivid example of what happens when law enforcement itself starts to buy into the argument that, "Oh, well, it's not such a big deal, everybody's doing it, so why should we pick on this guy?"
And he's telling you at various moments during this that he's not even managing any money. And it's hard to believe, since they're from the very beginning, they take these articles from various places. Barron's, I think, is one of them, and which talk about his skill as a money manager, and then he just simply lies to them, says, all I'm doing is clearing trades at 4 cents a trade. Mm-hmm. And all you have to do is the basic math on that to realize he can't possibly be making all the money he's making, either for his clients or for his own lifestyle.
Well, I think another outrageous thing you see in the Madoff case that surfaces in all of these is that these people do not lie in a vacuum. They have people around them who I would call enablers. In some cases, they're lawyers, they're high-level officials. It goes to this power dynamic as well. They're people who depend on them, and in the Madoff case, who were making many, many millions of dollars off of him. And to me, one of the most outrageous examples is the SEC. They were very timid about calling any Madoff clients. They were afraid to kind of roil the waters and get him upset. But they finally did at one point. They called his biggest investor, the Fairfield Greenwich, which was another hedge fund. All they did was move the money from the clients into Madoff and take a big chunk of the fee. So they called them and said, well, we want to ask you some questions about your trading with Madoff, or the Madoff trading. And what do? First of all, they immediately get on the phone and call Madoff and say, you're investing. We're going to be called about you, so tipping him off that the investigation is going on. Okay, maybe you can understand that. They're friends and business colleagues. Then Madoff calls them back and says, okay, the first thing he says is, now this conversation never happened. Now, and by the way, the general counsel is on the phone, the chief risk officer is on the phone.
And they're recording it.
Well, and the reason we know that his first line was, this conversation never happened, is because they had a history of dealing with Madoff, and he talked so fast they couldn't take notes. So there was an assistant instruct that whenever Madoff called, put the recorder on. So there is a tape recording of this entire conversation. So Madoff then proceeds to lecture them what they should tell the SEC, some of which is flagrantly at odds with the written materials that he's given them about what his trading strategy is. They then turn around and they go and basically say what Madoff told them to say in the investigation. Now, That's completely undermining, the course of justice.
Right. They are, of course...
And I think they are co-conspirators myself.
Yeah, as you point out in talking about loyalty, I mean, they're not loyal to him because they think he's such a great guy or a great philanthropist, which he portrayed himself as, but they were getting their 11% every year.
Well, they're 2 and 20. It was more than that. And
Well,
all
yeah,
they did,
sorry,
they did nothing.
11% for their clients, and they took 20% off the
All
top.
they did was raise money and then give it to Madoff. And for that, they were taking, 20%
Huge 20%.
of the gains.
One question you don't really answer, you talk about his internal enabler, the chief financial officer, who really was basically just generating the computer statements.
Right.
Bernie would tell him what to do and whatnot. It's hard to believe that something that involves $65 billion, at least coming in, it never went back out. I mean, it's hard to believe that $65 billion completely disappeared. That only the two of them were really engaged in this. That his sons claimed that they were not involved, and of course one of his sons committed suicide, and no one else seems to have played a major role in this. I mean, can that really what's your sense of it? There must have been some other people involved.
Well, 3 or 4 other people have pleaded guilty, lower level employees who are just doing the clerical work and participating and really constructing the phony statements. The big mystery is the family, the 2 sons and the wife, and no one's been charged. The sons were the ones who finally turned him in when things were collapsing in the financial crisis, indicating that at least on some level they didn't know the full extent of it. The only thing I found to suggest there might be anything else is that when asked in one of these investigations, well, what would happen if you were hit by a truck or something, who would take over this, since you seem to be the only person who knows the magic formula? He said, well, my sons could step in and they know, but he could have just been saying that. It could have been just another of many lies. I certainly didn't find any actual evidence that the sons did know. Now, should they have known? Should they have been suspicious? Yes, because the legitimate broker-dealer operation of Madoff, which was really just executing trades, was losing money every year.
Right.
All the profits from that operation came out of this mysterious hedge fund operation that supposedly no one else knew anything about. This is my father. I think at some point I'd like to know, Dad, where is this money coming from? But I don't know that conversation.
And what is that black box that that theory that works so well? The other thing that is confusing to me is $65 billion in. And some of that obviously is left.
Some of that was fictional.
Yeah.
The money was put in, and then the profits
So
would
that's
be
65
recorded.
billion is the profits that he.
People thought they had 65
$65
billion,
okay.
but the actual money that came in, I don't know what that number is. The trustee has indicated it.
And of course, the trustee has now spent about $1 billion, which is stunning. I mean, by itself, that's a scandal. It seems to me. And there are these various whistleblowers along the way. You talk about Harry Markopoulos, I don't know if I pronounce his name correctly, who basically outlined, he was outside, he didn't have any inside knowledge, but he basically outlined to the SEC what was happening. And there's some other,
Well, sophisticated people on Wall Street knew this was bogus, that what he claimed to be doing could not possibly generate those returns. Some of them kept that information to themselves. Others, like Markopoulos, brought it to their attention. But it didn't do any good.
In all of this, you talk again at the end of the book about integrity and trust as being core values in the world generally, and it seems to me in markets and in a democracy maybe even more important. And we seem to have gone through a series in the 80s with the Boskis and the Milkins, insider trading and stuff like that. In the 90s, we get the Enrons and the WorldComs and whatnot, huge accounting scandals, and then the biggest of them all in Bernie Madoff. Is there a systemic problem, or is this just human nature, and we're playing with bigger financial stakes these days?
Well, I mean, it's some of both. There's no question that lying is embedded in human nature. And my book is not about the millions of relatively harmless or insubstantial falsehoods that all of us are one time or another in a position that it's we've said. it's at that very serious level where you're put on notice that you have an obligation to tell the truth. You're taking an oath to tell the truth. You have a lawful obligation to tell the truth, and a lot depends on it. And then people who are still willing to lie about it. There, I think we do have serious structural problems. I mean, you mentioned I wrote a book about the Clintons. Bill Clinton was the President of the United States, the highest law enforcement officer in the country, a role model for the rest of the world, and he grudgingly acknowledged that he committed perjury. He committed it. And then to be bipartisan about this in Bush, in the Libby administration, after Libby was convicted with overwhelming evidence and sentenced to 3 years in jail, Bush commuted his sentence. And it was interesting to me that every case that I wrote about that came up after that, they'd come before the judge and they'd say, well, wait a minute, why are you doing this to me when Bush commuted?
Everybody does it is also the other excuse that you talk about.
Which is very pervasive when people get that idea to a breakdown of ethical behavior. So at the very top, we've had a complete lapse of leadership. And then I think more generally in society, partly stemming from that, the idea that the ends justify the means, that, you have to tell a few lies to get somewhere. And by the way, do you think that this is the first time most of these people ever told a lie? I don't think so. Martha Stewart, I think she had a long history of getting by with it. So they feel that that's the way to get ahead. And I think that I've noticed in the school systems. I mean, we did some articles when I was at the Wall Street Journal about cheating and lying in schools and what a problem that has become. Like kids and their parents condoning it, thinking they're getting into better colleges. And so the ends justify the means. So I feel that this has to be attacked at two levels. At the highest level, there have to be some examples set. I wish President Obama would speak out on this issue. Any president, I wish Romney in the campaign would bring this up. We need to have this reinforced at the very highest level. We need some prosecutions to deter future illegal behavior. And more importantly, I think all of us have to recognize the problem and serve as models in our own lives with our children. I mean, Doug Fanuel, who ends up doing the right thing and telling the truth, the only reason is because he couldn't look at himself in the mirror and live with himself based on his family upbringing, the values he learned, what he learned in school. It was more important to him to have his own integrity than to be lying under oath. We've all got to try to encourage the return of that attitude. And it's got to be a battle every day, every hour, and it's not going to be over anytime soon.
Is there... When Richard Nixon lied in Watergate, there was a kind of bipartisan consensus that came to be that he had to go. And maybe the two things are not commensurate, but it seems to me that we lost our way a little bit when Bill Clinton was impeached from 2 points of view. One, the Republicans tried to make a case of perjury about his sex life a high crime and misdemeanor, which it clearly was not, it seems to me. On the other hand, the Democrats decided to defend him at all costs, and nobody actually asked for his resignation. No Democrat asked for his resignation, and he did commit perjury. And it seems to me that there was a failure on both sides at that moment. That our standards slipped in a big way. Would you agree with that or not?
Well, I feel the Clinton example did enormous harm, both to law enforcement efforts and for trying to encourage respect for the obligation to tell the truth. If Bush had had the courage to stand by the verdict, it would have sent an important message that perjury is not going to be tolerated at the highest levels of government.
He did send some kind of a message by commuting the sentence rather than pardoning him. I mean, there was a recognition that there was a crime committed, I think, in doing that. Maybe.
I think that was a distinction lost on everyone except Dick Cheney.
Okay. Excellent. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's thank James Stewart.